close your eyes and let the gentle crackling of the fireplace beside you wash away the noise of the modern world. Tonight, we're about to witness something extraordinary. The final hours of a civilization that lasted longer than any empire in human history. The year is 1453, and the date is May 28th, just past midnight. Outside the ancient walls of Constantinople, the world's largest cannons rest silent in the darkness, their bronze mouths still smoking from the day's bombardment. But you're not standing with the conquerors tonight. You're walking through the marble corridors of the Byzantine palace, about to meet people who know their world is ending but refuse to surrender their dignity. This isn't just another siege story. This is about the human heart in its finest hour, about how people choose to spend their last night as citizens of an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years. You'll meet an emperor who reads philosophy while enemy armies surround his city, a young servant girl who holds the memory of a civilization in her mind, children who sleep peacefully while their world crumbles, and scholars racing against time to save the wisdom of ages. As you walk these corridors, breathing air heavy with frankincense and history, you'll discover something remarkable, that the end of the world can be the most beautiful time to be alive. Because when everything else falls away, what remains is purely human love, courage, faith, and an unshakable belief that some things matter more than survival. Listen to the fire beside you, feel its warmth, and step with me into Constantinople on the night before everything changed forever. The great palace stretched like a marble city within the city, its corridors echoing with 11 centuries of imperial footsteps. Tonight, those same halls witnessed something unprecedented. An emperor choosing to spend his final hours not in desperate military planning, but in quiet contemplation of what it means to rule, to serve, and to die with honor. Constantine XI Palaiologos sat in his private study, a room that had once belonged to his brother John VIII, surrounded by the intellectual treasures that had defined Byzantine civilization. At 58, he looked like a man who had aged gracefully under impossible pressure. His dark eyes, intelligent and melancholy, reflected the lamplight as he turned the pages of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a book written by another emperor who had faced the end of his world. "Listen to this, George," Constantine said quietly to his lifelong friend George Francis, who sat nearby in comfortable vigil. His voice carried the cultured accent of the Palaiologos dynasty, touched with the slight hoarseness that came from years of addressing councils and armies. The Roman emperor writes, "Death smiles at us all, but all a man can do is smile back." As Francis looked up from his own book, a copy of Anakomninos' Alexiad, the greatest historical work ever written by a Byzantine author. At 60, he had the weathered face of a man who had served through 3 reigns and watched an empire shrink from greatness to a single city. "Your Majesty finds comfort in the philosopher emperor?" "I find kinship," Constantine replied, running his finger along the manuscript's margin where his own notes crowded the parchment in careful Greek script. Marcus Aurelius also ruled at the end of an age. The old Roman virtues were dying around him. Barbarian tribes pressed at every frontier, and he could feel the world changing in ways he couldn't control. Yet he never stopped believing in duty, in dignity, in the possibility of noble action, even in hopeless circumstances. The study around them told the story of a dynasty that had always valued learning as much as warfare. The walls were lined with volumes that represented the intellectual achievement of Byzantium, philosophy and theology, mathematics and astronomy, poetry and history, all copied by hand over the centuries by monks and scholars who understood that preserving knowledge was a sacred duty. One shelf held the complete works of Plato and Aristotle, texts that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries, but carefully maintained in Constantinople. Another contained the writings of the Church Fathers, John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nazianzus, Basil the Great, whose theological insights had shaped Christian thought for a millennium. A third displayed historical works by Procopius, Michael Psellus, and other Byzantine chroniclers who had recorded their empire's triumphs and disasters with unflinching honesty. Do you know what strikes me most about our situation? Constantine continued, closing the book and looking directly at his friend. It's not the size of the enemy army or the power of their cannons. It's how clearly we can see what we're fighting for. When an empire is vast and secure, its values become abstract, theoretical. But when everything is stripped away except what truly matters, the essence becomes visible. He gestured toward the window, where the first faint light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon. Beyond the glass, Constantinople spread out like the living map of history. The great dome of Hagia Sophia dominated the skyline, its silhouette unchanged since Justinian's architects had raised it nearly 1,000 years earlier. Around it clustered dozens of smaller churches, their crosses catching the early light like stars. Between them, the red-tiled roofs of houses and shops created a tapestry of ordinary life, continuing even in extraordinary circumstances. Out there, Constantine said, people are baking bread they may never sell, writing letters that may never be delivered, telling their children stories that may be forgotten forever. They're doing these things not because they expect to benefit from them, but because these actions define who they are. That's what we're really defending, not territory or treasure, but the idea that human beings can choose to act nobly even when nobility seems pointless. Francis nodded slowly. He had known Constantine for over 50 years, had watched him grow from a dreamy boy who preferred books to swords into a man who could command armies and negotiate with sultans. But tonight, he was seeing something new in his emperor, a kind of philosophical clarity that came only to those who had accepted their fate completely. Your Majesty, as Francis said carefully, there are still ships in the harbor. The Genoese merchants would take you to safety if you asked. No one would call it cowardice. You've done everything possible to save the city. Constantine smiled, and for a moment his face showed the warmth that had made him beloved by everyone who served him. My dear friend, would Marcus Aurelius have abandoned Rome? Would Constantine the Great have fled from his new capital? I am the last Roman emperor. If the Roman Empire dies tomorrow, it will die with an emperor on its throne, not with an emperor in exile writing bitter memoirs about what might have been. The two men sat in comfortable silence as the dawn light grew stronger. Around them, the palace was beginning to stir with the quiet activities of those who had chosen to remain. In the kitchens, servants prepared what might be their final meals. In the chapel, priests continued the prayers that had been rising without interruption for 40 days. In the women's quarters, noble ladies comforted children whose understanding of the crisis was mercifully incomplete. But in this study, time seemed suspended. Two old friends, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, contemplated mortality and duty with the calmness that comes from a lifetime of service to ideals larger than themselves. They were not tragic figures, despite the tragedy of their circumstances. They were men who had found meaning in an age when meaning was in short supply, and who faced the end of their world with the same dignity they had shown in its preservation. In the labyrinthine passages of the palace's lower levels, where servants had lived and worked for generations, 23-year-old Anna Komnenos the Younger moved through her duties with unusual purpose. Unlike her famous namesake, the historian princess who had chronicled the reign of her father Alexio's eye, this Anna was born to service, not nobility. But tonight, she carried a burden that made her more important than any princess. She was the living memory of the palace itself. Anna had been born within these walls, the daughter of a seamstress who served the imperial household. She had taken her first steps on marble floors worn smooth by centuries of feet, had learned to speak among corridors where Greek, Latin, Italian, and Arabic mingled in the conversations of diplomats and merchants. Every tapestry, every carved column, every painted saint's face was as familiar to her as her own reflection. But Anna possessed something rarer than familiarity, she had what the palace's older servants called the memory gift. Despite never learning to read, she could recall with perfect accuracy every story she had ever heard, every song she had ever learned, every detail of court ceremony she had ever witnessed. In a world where most knowledge was transmitted orally, Anna was a living library. As she walked through the corridors carrying fresh candles to replace those that had burned low, Anna paused at each familiar sight, consciously storing details that might otherwise be lost forever. Here was the portrait of Emperor John VIII, Constantine's beloved brother, who had died trying to unite the Eastern and Western churches. She remembered the day it was hung, how the court painter had worried that the emperor's eyes looked too sad, and how John himself had said, "Let them be sad. A ruler who isn't saddened by his people's suffering isn't fit to rule." There was the icon of the Virgin Hodegetria, painted, tradition claimed, by St. Luke himself. Anna knew 17 different stories about this icon's miraculous interventions during previous sieges of Constantinople. She could recite the exact words of the prayers said before it each morning, the names of the emperors who had carried it into battle, the specific shade of blue used for the Virgin's robes, and the secret technique used to make the gold background seem to glow with inner light. In this alcove stood a statue of Constantine the Great, carved from a single block of porphyry so expensive that its cost could have fed a small city for a year. Anna remembered her grandmother telling her that the statue's eyes had been positioned to catch the first ray of sunlight each dawn, symbolizing how Constantine had brought the light of Christianity to the Roman Empire. She knew which finger had been broken during the earthquake of 1346, and how it had been repaired by a master craftsman who had wept while working because he knew his skills could never truly match those of the original sculptor. As Anna replaced a candle in the Imperial Library, she encountered a scene that filled her with both hope and overwhelming sadness. Master John Kanakazinos, the chief librarian, worked with several assistants to save the most precious manuscripts in the collection. They moved with quiet urgency, wrapping volumes in oiled cloth, sealing them in wooden boxes, preparing them for hiding or transport to safety beyond the city walls. Anna, the librarian, called softly as she approached. Master Kanakazinos was a man of 70 who had devoted his entire life to these books. His hands, stained with decades of ink, trembled slightly as he held a manuscript of Sappho's complete poems, the only surviving copy in the world. "Come here, child. I want to show you something." He opened the volume carefully, revealing pages covered with the most beautiful handwriting Anna had ever seen. The Greek letters seemed to dance across the parchment, accompanied by delicate illustrations that showed scenes from the poems. Lovers meeting in moonlit gardens, young women dancing at festivals, ships sailing across wine-dark seas. This was copied 300 years ago by a nun named Theodora, who lived on the island of Lesbos. Master Kanakazinos explained, his voice heavy with emotion. She spent 7 years creating this single book, copying every poem, painting every illustration, even growing the plants she used to make the inks. She wrote in her colophon that she hoped these poems would survive until the end of the world, to remind people that human beings have always loved beauty, always yearned for connection, always found ways to express the inexpressible. Anna stared at the pages, trying to memorize every detail. Though she couldn't read the words themselves, she understood their importance. "Master, will the books be safe?" "Some will survive," he replied, carefully closing the volume and wrapping it in silk before placing it in a cedar box. "We're sending copies to Italy, to France, to any place that will receive them. But Anna, the books themselves are not the real treasure. The real treasure is the knowledge they contain, the ideas they preserve, the inspiration they provide. Those things live not in parchment and ink, but in human minds and hearts." He placed his ink-stained hand gently on her shoulder. "You have the gift of memory, child. You carry in your mind stories and songs and traditions that exist nowhere else. If you survive tomorrow, If you live to tell your grandchildren about this night, then something precious of Byzantium will continue to exist. You are a living book, Anna, and perhaps the most important one in this entire library. As she continued her rounds, Anna felt the weight of this responsibility settling on her shoulders like an imperial cloak. She began to consciously memorize everything she saw. The way candlelight played across the bronze face of an ancient emperor, the exact pattern of where on marble steps climbed by generations of servants, the sound of wind whistling through windows that had watched the sun rise and set over Constantinople for centuries. In the palace kitchens, she found Master Maximos shaping bread with the same careful attention he had shown for 40 years of service. At 85, he was the oldest servant in the palace, and his memory reached back to times that seemed almost mythical to younger staff. "Anna, my dear," he said without looking up from his work, "come help an old man remember. What was the name of that spice merchant from Alexandria who used to bring cinnamon to the palace? He had a scar on his left hand from a shark bite, and he always told the most wonderful stories about sea monsters." "Nymphoros Cantacasinos," Anna replied immediately. "He came every spring for 15 years, until the Ottomans took Alexandria. He had 3 sons, and the youngest one, Demetrios, wanted to become a monk at Mount Athos. His stories weren't about sea monsters, master. They were about jinn that lived in underwater palaces and granted wishes to sailors who treated them with respect." Master Maximo smiled and nodded. "Yes, that's right. I'm getting old, mixing up my memories. Thank God for your gift, child. When I am gone, who will remember these things?" "I will," Anna said simply, "and I'll teach them to someone else, who will teach them to someone else, and that way the stories will never die." As dawn approached, Anna found herself in the palace's highest tower, a small chamber that offered a panoramic view of Constantinople. The city spread out below her like a living map, its rooftops and churches and markets beginning to stir with early morning activity. Smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys as families prepared their morning meals. Bells from dozens of churches marked the beginning of the daily round of prayers. Fishing boats dotted the Golden Horn, their crews preparing for another day's work despite the uncertainty that surrounded them. Looking out over this scene, Anna realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in human history. The final morning of the Roman Empire. For over 2,000 years, since Augustus first wore the purple in Rome, there had been an unbroken succession of Roman emperors. Tomorrow night, that succession would end forever. But as she watched the city below, beginning its daily rhythm of life and work, Anna understood something that filled her with strange comfort. Empires might fall, dynasties might end, armies might conquer cities, but the essential human activities, the baking of bread, the telling of stories, the care of children, the creation of beauty, these things continued regardless of who wore the crown or which flag flew from the palace. She began to recite, in a voice so soft that only the morning breeze could hear, all the stories she knew about Constantinople. How Constantine the Great had chosen this site after seeing a vision of an eagle carrying a cross. How Justinian had built Hagia Sophia after dreaming of angels showing him the perfect proportions. How ordinary people had lived and loved and hoped within these walls for over 1,000 years, creating a civilization that was both magnificent and deeply human. If she survived the coming day, Anna promised herself she would find a way to pass these stories on, not because they were about emperors and empires, but because they were about human beings trying to create meaning and beauty in a world that could be both wonderful and terrible. And that, she realized, was a story worth preserving no matter what happened to the marble palaces and golden crowns. In the women's quarters of the palace, where soft voices had whispered lullabies to imperial children for centuries, Empress Helena Cantacasinos moved among a group of refugee children with the gentle authority of someone born to comfort others. Helena was not Constantine's wife. The emperor had never married. dedicating his life entirely to the empire. But she was his sister-in-law, the widow of his brother Thomas. Tonight, she had taken on the role of mother to all who needed comfort in the darkness. The children ranged in age from 5 to 15, representing every level of Byzantine society. There was little Zoe, barely 6 years old, whose parents had died in the last Ottoman raids on the countryside outside Constantinople. Her large dark eyes held the particular sadness of children who have seen too much too early. But tonight, they sparkled with interest as Helena began her stories. Beside her sat the twin Sophia and Irene, daughters of a minor noble family, whose father had sent them to the capital believing they would be safer in the palace than in their ancestral estate. 13-year-old Constantine Cantacuzenios, named, like so many Byzantine boys, for the great emperor who had founded the city, listened with the serious attention of someone old enough to understand that he was witnessing history. His father had been killed fighting in Anatolia 2 years earlier, and he had developed a grave demeanor that comes to children forced to grow up too quickly. But tonight, surrounded by the warmth of the fireplace and Helena's motherly presence, he allowed himself to be simply a boy listening to wonderful stories. The room itself created an atmosphere of safety and comfort that seemed to exist outside the dangerous world beyond the palace walls. Tapestries depicting scenes from the lives of saints covered the walls, their rich colors still vivid despite their age. Icons of the Virgin Mary and Christ gazed down with expressions of infinite compassion. The floor was covered with carpets woven in traditional Byzantine patterns, their geometric designs incorporating crosses, eagles, and other symbols that connected the children to their heritage. "Tonight," Helena said, settling into her chair by the fireplace while the children arranged themselves on cushions around her feet, "I want to tell you about the great Emperor Justinian and his magnificent Empress Theodora. They lived here in this very palace almost 1,000 years ago, when our empire stretched from Spain to Persia, and Constantinople was the greatest city in the world." As she spoke, Helena's voice took on a musical quality that all great storytellers possess. She had learned these tales from her own grandmother, who had learned them from generations of palace women before her. Each story had been polished smooth by countless tellings, shaped and refined until every word contributed to the magic. "Justinian was a man of great dreams," Helena continued, her eyes reflecting the firelight as she gazed at the children's upturned faces. "He dreamed of reconquering all the lands that had once belonged to Rome. He dreamed of creating laws that would bring justice to all his people. But his greatest dream was to build a church so beautiful that it would be like heaven on earth. And do you know what church that was?" "Hagia Sophia," several children called out in unison, their faces bright with pleasure at knowing the answer. "Yes, Hagia Sophia, the great church where people are praying at this very moment, just as they have prayed there every day for nearly 1,000 years. But do you know how it came to be built? It's a story of courage and faith, and the power of never giving up, even when everything seems hopeless." Helena went on to tell them about the Nika riots, when the people of Constantinople rose up against Justinian and nearly drove him from his throne. She described how the emperor was ready to flee the city, how his advisors urged him to escape by ship and seek safety in distant lands. And then she told them about Theodora's speech, words that had been remembered and repeated for centuries because they captured something essential about courage in the face of defeat. "Theodora stood before the emperor and his council," Helena said, her voice growing stronger as she quoted the empress's famous words. And she said, "My lords, now is not the time to debate whether women should give advice to men. Those who have worn the purple should never survive its loss. If you wish to flee, your majesty, well and good. You have money and ships, and the sea lies open before you. But as for me, I like the old saying, purple makes the best burial shroud." The children listened in fascinated silence, their imaginations painting pictures of the magnificent empress standing defiant before emperors and generals. Helena could see in their faces that They were not just hearing a story, but absorbing a lesson about dignity, about loyalty, about the kind of courage that doesn't depend on having superior numbers or better weapons. "But Mama Helena," whispered little Zoe, using the title by which all the palace children addressed her. "What happened then? Did the emperor stay and fight?" "He did, little one. Justinian found his courage again, and he and Theodora worked together to save their empire. They built Hagia Sophia as a thanksgiving for their victory, and it became the wonder of the world. But more than that, they showed that sometimes the greatest victories come not from strength or cleverness, but from the simple decision to remain true to who you are, no matter what the cost." As the night deepened, Helena told them more stories, each one carefully chosen to comfort and inspire. She spoke of Saint Basil the Great, who had sold his inheritance to feed the poor and build hospitals. She told them about the scholar Photios, who had founded libraries and schools because he believed that knowledge belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy. She shared tales of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things, a baker who had given away his last loaf to feed a hungry child, a soldier who had risked his life to save an enemy's wounded comrade, a young girl who had preserved important books by hiding them from invaders. With each story, Helena was doing more than entertaining the children. She was passing on the values that had sustained Byzantine civilization for over 1,000 years. The belief that learning was precious, that beauty mattered, that every person possessed inherent dignity, that faith could sustain human beings through any trial. These were not abstract concepts, but living principles embodied in the stories of real people who had faced real challenges. Young Constantine raised his hand, his expression serious beyond his 13 years. "Mama Helena, my father told me before he died that no matter what happens to our empire, we will always be Byzantine in our hearts." What did he mean? Helena paused, understanding that this question went to the heart of what this night was really about. How do you explain to children that their world is ending while simultaneously teaching them that some things are more permanent than empires? "Your father was very wise, Constantine," she said gently. "Being Byzantine isn't just about living in this city or serving this emperor, though we are proud to do both. It's about carrying certain ideas and beliefs with you wherever you go. It's about remembering that learning is sacred, that beauty enriches the soul, that every human being is made in God's image and deserves to be treated with respect. It's about understanding that we are part of a great chain of people stretching back centuries, all of whom tried to preserve and pass on the best of human achievement." She gestured toward the icons on the walls, their golden faces seeming to glow in the firelight. "These saints we honor. They came from every walk of life and every corner of the empire. Some were emperors, some were peasants, some were scholars, some were simple fishermen. But they all understood that this life is temporary, while the things of the spirit are eternal. They showed us that you can be courageous even when you're afraid, generous even when you have little, faithful even when the world seems to be falling apart." 14-year-old Irene, one of the twins, spoke up with the directness that characterized adolescence throughout history. "But what if we have to leave Constantinople? What if we can never come back? How can we still be Byzantine if we don't live in the Byzantine Empire?" Helena smiled at the girl's forthrightness. "My dear child, do you remember the story I told you last week about St. John Chrysostom? He was the Archbishop of Constantinople 4 centuries ago, and he was so eloquent in his preaching that people called him Golden Mouth. But he made powerful enemies at court, and eventually he was exiled from the city he loved, sent to die in a remote village on the edge of the empire." The children nodded, remembering the tale. Now, when St. John was forced to leave Constantinople, did he stop being a great teacher? Did his words lose their power? Did his faith become less real? "No," several children said together. "Of course not. If anything, his teachings became more powerful because people could see that he lived by them even when it cost him everything. He carried Constantinople in his heart to that distant village, and his letters and sermons from exile became some of the most beautiful and inspiring writings in all of Christian literature. The city where he was born became less important than the city he carried within himself, the eternal city of faith and wisdom and love. Helena rose from her chair and moved to the window, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to show in the eastern sky. Beyond the palace walls, Constantinople was waking to what might be its final day as a Byzantine city. But in this room, warmed by the fire and filled with young voices eager to learn and remember, the essence of Byzantium lived on. "Come here, children," she said softly, beckoning them to join her at the window. "Look out there at our city. See the dome of Hagia Sophia catching the first light? See the crosses on all those churches. See the red roofs and the narrow streets where families are starting their daily routines." The children crowded around her, their faces pressed against the cool glass. All of that, the buildings, the walls, the harbor, even the palace where we stand, those are just things made of stone and wood and metal. They can be conquered. They can be destroyed. They can be forgotten. But what makes them special, what makes them sacred, is not their material, but the love and hope and faith and dreams that people have poured into them for 1,000 years. Little Zoe tugged at Helena's sleeve. "Mama Helena, does that mean if we remember the stories and keep believing in the good things, then Byzantium will never really die?" Helena knelt down and gathered the small girl into her arms, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's exactly what it means, little one. Empires rise and fall, but the things that make us human, the capacity for love, for learning, for creating beauty, for choosing good over evil even when it's difficult, those things are eternal. And as long as there are people who remember and cherish these values, as long as there are children who want to hear stories about courage and faith and wisdom, then the best of Byzantium will live forever." As the dawn light grew stronger, the children gradually settled into sleep. Some curled up on the carpets by the dying fire. Others nestled in chairs and cushions throughout the room. Helena moved among them quietly, covering each with soft blankets, whispering prayers over their peaceful faces. Looking at these sleeping children, some orphaned by war, others separated from their families by circumstances beyond their control, all of them facing an uncertain future, Helena felt her heart break and mend simultaneously. They represented hope itself, the possibility that goodness could survive disaster, that wisdom could outlast empires, that love could triumph over fear. Outside, the sounds of the stirring city drifted through the windows, church bells calling the faithful to morning prayers, the voices of market vendors setting up their stalls, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones as early travelers began their journeys. Constantinople was beginning its final day as a Byzantine city, but life continued with its ancient rhythms of work and worship, hope and human connection. And in the women's quarters of the great palace, surrounded by sleeping children and watched over by icons that had blessed imperial births for centuries, Empress Helena kept her vigil, holding in her heart all the stories that made these young lives precious, all the dreams that would help them build new homes and new hope wherever their journeys might lead them. In the soaring spaces of Hagia Sophia, the great church that had stood as the architectural wonder of the world for nearly 9 centuries, hundreds of people had gathered for what they understood might be the last Byzantine liturgy ever celebrated beneath its famous dome. The building itself seemed to participate in the worship, its vast interior creating acoustic effects that made even whispered prayers resonate with otherworldly beauty. The church that Emperor Justinian had built was more than an architectural masterpiece. It was a theological statement in stone and mortar, a place where the mathematics of sacred geometry met the mysteries of faith. The great central dome, suspended seemingly without support 180 feet above the marble floor, had been designed to create the illusion of heaven touching earth. When sunlight streamed through the windows at its base, the dome appeared to float like a golden bowl filled with divine light. Tonight, however, the church was illuminated not by sunlight, but by thousands of candles and oil lamps, their flickering flames reflecting off the golden mosaics that covered every surface. Christ Pantocrator gazed down from the dome with eyes that seemed to follow each worshiper with infinite compassion. The Virgin Mary held the Christ child in her arms, surrounded by angels whose wings caught and scattered the candlelight into patterns of moving gold. Saints and emperors rendered in tiny cubes of colored glass and precious metals created a visual symphony that had inspired worshippers for nearly a millennium. The congregation that filled the church tonight represented every level of Byzantine society. Emperor Constantine knelt in a side chapel, having laid aside his imperial regalia to worship as a simple believer. Beside him prayed his advisors and generals, men who had shared the burden of these final years, and who now united in faith despite their occasional political disagreements. Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, the commander of what remained of the Byzantine fleet, knelt with his head bowed, his weathered hands clasped before him. These were hands that had held ships' wheels in storm and battle, that had signed treaties and deployed naval strategies. But tonight, they held only prayer beads worn smooth by decades of use. His rivalry with Constantine over the union with Rome seemed infinitely distant now, irrelevant in the face of eternity. Near the great marble columns that supported the dome, George Francis prayed beside his wife and children. At 60, he had served 3 emperors and recorded the empire's decline with meticulous care, but tonight his historian's objectivity gave way to simple human need for divine comfort. His notebook lay forgotten in his chambers. There would be time later to record this night's events, if later existed at all. Among the crowd of noble and common worshippers were also foreigners who had chosen to remain in Constantinople despite having no obligation to do so. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had brought 700 soldiers to defend the city, stood with his men near the church's great western entrance. These professional warriors from Italy, Spain, and France had fought in battles across the Mediterranean, but none had ever experienced a religious service quite like this one. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the papal representative who had fled after the failed Council of Florence, but returned to share Constantinople's fate, celebrated the liturgy alongside the Orthodox Patriarch. For this one night, the theological disputes that had divided Eastern and Western Christianity for centuries were set aside in favor of unity before God. The Patriarch Gregory III, despite his advanced age, led the service with a voice that carried clearly through the vast space. The liturgy being celebrated was the same one that had sanctified this church for centuries, with prayers and hymns that dated back to the earliest days of Christianity. But tonight, every word seemed to carry additional weight. Every gesture appeared touched with finality. As the Patriarch raised the consecrated bread and wine, the entire congregation fell into profound silence. In this moment, the Ottoman siege might as well have been taking place on another planet. The cannons positioned outside the walls seemed infinitely distant. Time itself appeared to stop as the central mystery of the Christian faith unfolded in words and actions that had remained unchanged for over 1,000 years. Young Theodoros Lascaris, a novice monk from the monastery of Pantocrator, found himself overwhelmed by the beauty and solemnity of the moment. At 19, he had entered religious life to escape the political chaos that surrounded the dying empire, but tonight he discovered something deeper than escape. He found meaning in the midst of apparent meaninglessness, hope in the shadow of despair. As he chanted the ancient hymns, Theodoros became aware that he was participating in something that connected him not only to the present congregation, but to every generation of Christians who had worshipped in this sacred space. The marble beneath his feet had been worn smooth by the knees of saints and sinners, emperors and beggars, all seeking the same divine presence that seemed almost tangible in the flickering candlelight. The service continued for hours, following the ancient rhythm of prayer and praise that had structured Orthodox worship since the early centuries of Christianity. Hymns rose to the dome and seemed to linger there, as if the building itself participated in the singing. The congregation moved through the familiar patterns of standing and kneeling, crossing themselves, kissing icons, lighting candles, each action connecting them not only to God but to the countless generations who had performed these same rituals in this same space. Maria Paleologina, the widow who supported her 3 children by selling religious candles, knelt with her family in a side chapel dedicated to St. Nicholas. Her 16-year-old son Demetrius wanted desperately to join the city's defenders, while her twin daughters looked to her for reassurance about their future. Tonight, surrounded by the familiar rituals of their faith, Maria found the strength to be the anchor her children needed. "Mama," Sophia whispered during a quiet moment in the service, "why do the hymns sound different tonight?" Maria listened to the ancient Greek chants rising and falling around them, noting how the voices seemed to carry additional resonance in the vast space. "They don't sound different, my darling. We're hearing them differently. When you know that something precious might be lost, you listen more carefully. You notice details that you might have missed before. The hymns are the same, but our hearts are more open to their beauty." As dawn approached and the service neared its conclusion, Patriarch Gregory offered a final blessing that seemed to encompass not just the people present, but the entire history of Christian Byzantium. His words, spoken in the ancient Greek of the liturgy, carried the weight of centuries. "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." But even as the formal service ended, many worshippers remained in the church, reluctant to leave this sacred space that had provided comfort to so many generations. They knelt before favorite icons, lit candles for the souls of departed loved ones, whispered private prayers that rose like incense to the golden dome above. Constantine himself lingered longest of all, spending nearly an hour in solitary prayer before the icon of Christ that hung near the main altar. This icon, painted in the traditional Pantocrator style, showed Jesus with one side of his face representing his divine nature, serene, eternal, all-knowing, while the other revealed his human nature, compassionate, understanding, touched with sorrow at human suffering. As Constantine prayed before this ancient image, he found himself engaged in the kind of intimate conversation with the divine that only comes in moments of ultimate crisis. The burdens of empire, the weight of impossible decisions, the knowledge that he might be the last emperor of the Romans, all of these concerns seemed to flow out of him in a stream of wordless prayer. "Give me wisdom," he whispered to the painted Christ, his voice barely audible even to himself. Not wisdom to avoid what is coming, but wisdom to face it with dignity. "Let me be worthy of the trust placed in me by all these people who have chosen to remain in the city. Let my death, if it comes, have meaning beyond the ending of a dynasty." The Christ's painted eyes seemed to regard him with infinite understanding, as if this divine figure comprehended not just Constantine's personal struggles, but the cosmic significance of this moment when the last thread connecting the present to the ancient Roman world was about to be severed. When Constantine finally rose from his knees, he found that he was not alone. Anna Komnenos the younger, the servant girl with the perfect memory, knelt nearby before an icon of the Virgin Mary. She had come to Hagia Sophia not for the formal liturgy, but for her own private communion with the sacred, and she had remained throughout the night, adding her own voiceless prayers to the centuries of worship that had sanctified this space. "Your Majesty," she said softly, rising respectfully as she noticed the Emperor's presence. "Anna," Constantine replied, recognizing her immediately. Despite the vast gulf in their social positions, they had both grown up within the palace walls and had known each other for years. "You have been praying long tonight." "I've been trying to remember, Your Majesty," she said simply. "All the ceremonies I've witnessed in this church, all the weddings and baptisms and coronations. I want to keep them safe in my memory in case no one else remembers. Constantine finished gently. That's wise, Anna. Memory is the most powerful force we have. Stronger than armies, more durable than walls. What you carry in your mind about this place, about our people, about our traditions, that's more valuable than all the gold in the imperial treasury. They stood together in comfortable silence, emperor and servant, united in their love for the civilization they had both served in their different ways. Around them, the great church seemed to pulse with the accumulated prayers of nearly 1,000 years. Each whispered petition adding another layer to the spiritual foundation that made this place more than mere architecture. Anna, Constantine said finally, if you survive tomorrow, will you promise me something? Of course, Your Majesty. Don't let them turn us into myths. When you tell the stories about this night, about these people, remember that we were human beings. We were afraid. We made mistakes. We doubted ourselves. But we tried to do what was right. And we tried to preserve something beautiful and good for those who would come after us. That's all any of us can do, whether we're emperors or servants. Try to leave the world a little better than we found it. As they emerged from Hagia Sophia into the pre-dawn light, Constantinople spread before them like a city suspended between two worlds. The ancient streets and buildings carried the weight of 11 centuries of history, while the future pressed against the city walls with all the uncertainty of an unwritten page. Along the great land wall that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years, the defenders made their final preparations as the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn. This massive fortification, consisting of 3 separate barriers, rising one behind the other like the stone tsunami frozen in time, had turned back every army that had attempted to take the city by land assault. Tonight, it would face its ultimate test. Giovanni Giustiniani moved along the battlements with the practiced eye of a professional soldier who had fought in conflicts from Spain to Cyprus. At 45, the Genoese commander had seen enough warfare to understand both the possibilities and limitations of defensive fighting. He had come to Constantinople not for money. The Byzantine treasury was nearly empty, but because he recognized that some things were worth defending regardless of the odds. The section of wall under his command showed clear evidence of the damage inflicted by the massive Ottoman cannons, particularly the great gun designed by the Hungarian engineer Urban. Stones that had fit together so perfectly that mortar was barely needed were now cracked and scattered. Entire sections of the outer wall had been reduced to rubble, but Giustiniani had positioned his 700 men to make maximum use of the wall's remaining strengths while compensating for its weaknesses. Captain Julia, he called to the Catalan officer, who commanded a company of Spanish and Italian volunteers. Have your men completed the repairs to the stockade behind the breach? Pere Julia, a thoughtful man in his 30s who had developed his own philosophy about warfare through years of Mediterranean conflicts, nodded as he approached. The gap is filled with earth and timber, and we've positioned caltrops and other obstacles to slow any assault. But Captain, my men have been asking questions that I find difficult to answer. What sort of questions? They want to know why we're here. They understand that we could leave with honor. No one expects foreigners to die for a lost cause. They're good soldiers who have followed me through many campaigns, but they need to understand what we're fighting for beyond simple duty. Giustiniani paused in his inspection of the fortifications and looked out over the city that lay sleeping behind them. From this height, Constantinople spread out like a living map of history, its domed churches and red-tiled roofs, creating a tapestry of ordinary life, continuing despite extraordinary circumstances. Smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys as families prepared their morning meals. The harbor was dotted with fishing boats whose crews were setting out for another day's work, maintaining their ancient routines even as the world around them prepared to change forever. Tell them, Giustiniani said finally. that some things are worth defending even when victory is impossible. This city, this empire, they have preserved something precious for over 1,000 years. When the barbarians were burning libraries in the West, Byzantine scholars kept alive the learning of the ancient world. When Europe was fragmenting into warring tribes, Constantinople maintained the traditions of Roman law and Greek philosophy. When art and beauty were luxuries that few could afford, this empire created works that enriched all of humanity. He gestured toward the city below, where the great dome of Hagia Sophia caught the first rays of sunlight like a golden crown. That building down there has inspired people for 9 centuries. It has sheltered worshippers through plagues and famines, invasions and civil wars. The mathematics of its construction, the theology of its decoration, the simple fact that human beings could conceive and build something so beautiful that deserves to be defended, regardless of whether we can save it. Julia nodded slowly, understanding something in Giustiniani's words that went beyond military strategy. And if we fall today, then we will have borne witness to the end of something great, and we will have shown that there are still men willing to fight for ideals rather than profit. Our deaths will testify that not all soldiers are mercenaries, that some values transcend personal survival. That testimony has its own kind of victory. As they continued their inspection, they encountered other defenders, making their own preparations for the coming battle. Orhan Shalebi, an Ottoman prince who had found refuge in Constantinople and now fought against his own people out of gratitude and conviction, knelt in prayer on the ramparts. His presence among the defenders was a living reminder that this conflict was about more than mere nationalism. It was about the clash between different visions of civilization. Near the palace gate, Constantine Cantacuzenios, scion of one of Byzantium's greatest families, checked the weapons and armor of the Imperial Guard. These were men who had sworn to protect the emperor with their lives, and tonight that oath carried special weight. They knew that if the city fell, their own survival was questionable at best, but their commitment never wavered. Theodore Karastinos, the captain of the palace guard, inspected each man's equipment with the attention to detail that had made him one of Constantine's most trusted officers. Remember, he told his soldiers, we fight not just for the emperor, but for the idea of emperorship, for the principle that legitimate authority comes from service to the people, not from the ability to seize power through force. Among the defenders were also ordinary citizens who had chosen to take up arms rather than flee or surrender. Demetrius Paleologos, the 16-year-old son of Maria the candle seller, stood with a group of young men from his neighborhood, each armed with whatever weapons they could find. These were not professional soldiers, but apprentices and shopkeepers, students and clerks, united by their refusal to abandon the city of their birth. "Are you afraid?" asked Nikephoros Cantacuzenios, a baker's son of the same age, who had become Demetrius's closest friend during the weeks of siege. "Of course I'm afraid," Demetrius replied honestly. "But my mother told me once that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about choosing to do what's right even when you are afraid. My ancestors have lived in this city for 600 years. If it's going to fall, then at least one member of the Paleologos family will be here to see it happen." As the sun climbed higher, the sounds of the awakening city drifted up to the defenders on the walls. Church bells called the faithful to morning prayers, their bronze voices joining in a complex harmony that had marked the passage of time in Constantinople for centuries. Market vendors began setting up their stalls, maintaining the ancient rhythms of commerce even in the face of uncertainty. Children's voices could be heard from the palace courtyards, where Helena continued her storytelling to comfort young refugees. From the enemy camps beyond the walls came different sounds. The drum beats that marked the changing of the guard, the neighing of thousands of horses, the metallic clanking of weapons and armor being prepared for battle. The contrast was stark. On one side, the sounds of life continuing. On the other, the sounds of war preparing. But it was what couldn't be heard that worried the defenders most. Urban's great cannon, which had thundered against the walls for weeks, remained silent. The massive gun that could hurl stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds was being repositioned for what everyone knew would be the final assault. When that cannon spoke again, the decisive battle for Constantinople would begin. Justiniani climbed to the highest tower of his section of wall and surveyed the Ottoman positions through a spyglass that had been a gift from a Venetian merchant. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The enemy had spent the night bringing up additional artillery, positioning siege towers, and massing troops for a coordinated assault that would test every inch of the city's defenses simultaneously. "They'll come at dawn," he told Julia. "3 waves, probably. First the irregulars and auxiliaries. They'll test our defenses and exhaust our ammunition. Then the regulars from Anatolia, disciplined troops who will try to exploit any weaknesses the first wave reveals. Finally, the Janissaries, the Sultan's personal guard, the finest soldiers in his army." "Can we hold?" Justiniani was quiet for a long moment, his experience at calculating odds and possibilities. "We can make them pay dearly for every inch. We can show them that free men defending their homes fight differently than slaves fighting for plunder. We can ensure that if Constantinople falls, it falls with honor." As he spoke, a new sound rose from the enemy camp, the haunting call of Islamic prayers echoing across the battlefield. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers knelt in unison, facing Mecca, preparing their souls for what they too understood would be a decisive battle. It was a reminder that courage and faith existed on both sides of this conflict, that the men preparing to attack the city were also following their own sincere beliefs about duty and divine will. The sounds of prayer from both camps, Christian bells from within the city, Islamic chants from without, created a strange counterpoint that spoke to something universal about human nature and extremis. When facing mortality, whether as attacker or defender, people turn to the eternal, seeking meaning that transcends the immediate concerns of victory and defeat. Standing on the ancient walls that had protected Constantinople through countless sieges, surrounded by men who had chosen to risk everything for a cause larger than themselves, Justiniani felt the weight of history settling around him like armor. Today would determine not just the fate of a city, but the direction of civilization itself. Whether the future belonged to Christian Europe or the Islamic East would be decided by the courage of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. As the morning light grew stronger, revealing the vast Ottoman army spread across the plains before the city like a dark sea, the defenders of Constantinople prepared to write the final chapter of an empire that had lasted longer than any in human history. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, but they possessed something that no army could take from them. The knowledge that they stood for something greater than themselves, something worth dying to preserve. The last day of Byzantium was about to begin. As the morning sun climbed higher over Constantinople, revealing the full scope of the Ottoman armies arrayed beyond the city walls, Emperor Constantine convened what he knew would be the final council meeting in the 1,000-year history of the Byzantine Empire. The setting was the Hall of the Golden Cupola, a chamber that had witnessed some of the most momentous decisions in European history. The hall itself was a masterpiece of Byzantine architecture and decoration. The walls were covered with mosaics depicting the great victories of imperial history, Justinian's reconquest of Italy and Africa, Basil II's triumph over the Bulgarian Empire, the glorious return of Michael VIII Palaiologos when the Byzantines reclaimed Constantinople from the Latin Crusaders. Tonight, these images of past glory provided both inspiration and painful contrast to present circumstances. The golden cupola that gave the hall its name was decorated with a mosaic of Christ in majesty, surrounded by the symbols of the 4 evangelists and 24 elders offering their crowns to the divine throne. The morning light streaming through the windows set the gold tesserae ablaze, creating the illusion that heaven itself was illuminating this final gathering of Byzantine leadership. Present at this last council were the men who had chosen to share Constantinople's fate rather than seek safety in exile. Giovanni Giustiniani represented the foreign defenders, his presence a testament to the universal appeal of the values Byzantium represented. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev spoke for the small Catholic contingent and the complicated religious politics that had plagued the empire's final decades. Lucas Notaras, the Grand Duke who commanded what remained of the Byzantine fleet, sat across from George Francis, the emperor's closest friend and most trusted advisor. These two men had sometimes disagreed on policy. Notaras had opposed the union with Rome whilst Francis supported it, but such differences seemed insignificant now compared to their shared love for the empire they had served their entire lives. Also present were Constantine Cantacuzenios, scion of one of Byzantium's greatest families, Theodore Karastinos, commander of the palace guard, and several other nobles and military officers who had chosen honor over survival. Each man in the room understood that he was participating in history, that their words and decisions would be remembered and analyzed for centuries to come. The meeting began with a military briefing that confirmed what everyone already knew. The situation was hopeless from a purely tactical standpoint. The Ottoman forces vastly outnumbered the defenders. The city's walls, though still formidable, had been severely damaged by artillery bombardment. Supplies were running low, and no relief force was coming from the west, despite years of appeals to European rulers. "Gentlemen," Constantine said, his voice calm and steady despite the gravity of the moment, "we gather here not to debate strategy. The course of action is clear to all of us. We gather to ensure that our final hours as an empire are worthy of our history. Tomorrow, we face the greatest challenge our people have ever confronted. I want each of you to know that you are free to leave the city if you choose. No man should be bound to die for a cause unless it is his own free decision." Giustiniani spoke first, his words carrying the authority of a professional soldier who had seen battles across the Mediterranean. "Your Majesty, I came to Constantinople to defend this city and its people, and that is what I shall do. My men and I will hold our section of the wall as long as there is strength in our bodies and breath in our lungs. We fight not just for Constantinople, but for the principle that some things are worth defending regardless of the odds." Cardinal Isidore nodded gravely, his presence representing the complex relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity that had dominated Byzantine diplomacy for centuries. "The Church stands with the Empire, Your Majesty. If this city falls, it will not be from lack of faith or courage on our part. We fight tomorrow not just for Constantinople, but for all of Christianity. The road to Rome lies through these walls." One by one, the other commanders pledged their commitment. Lucas Notaras, despite his past disagreements with imperial policy, spoke with particular emotion. "Your Majesty, we have had our differences over the years about the best path for our empire, but tonight we are united in purpose. The fleet will fight until the last ship is sunk and the last sailor has given his life for the city of his birth." Theodore Karastinos, who commanded the Imperial Guard, stood to make his declaration. "The Guard exists to protect the Emperor and the Empire. Tomorrow, we will fulfill that duty completely. Let it be recorded that the last Roman legions died as Roman legions should, facing their enemies, defending their standards, loyal to their oath." Constantine Cantacuzenios, representing one of the greatest families in Byzantine history, added his own pledge. "For 8 centuries, the Cantacuzenios family has served the empire in peace and war. Tomorrow, we will serve it for the last time, and we will serve it well." As each man spoke, the weight of what they were doing became almost palpable. They were not just planning military strategy, but participating in a ritual that connected them to every generation of Byzantines who had faced overwhelming odds with dignity and courage. They were adding their names to a roll of honor that stretched back to Constantine the Great and beyond, to the Roman generals who had first carried eagles into battle for the glory of the eternal city. "There is something else I must tell you," Constantine said when the military pledges had been completed. "Yesterday, I received a final message from Sultan Mehmed. He offers us terms for surrender that are not without merit. The lives of all civilians would be spared. The churches would remain open. Those who choose to leave the city would be allowed to depart with their possessions. Those who remain would be granted the status of protected subjects under Islamic law." A murmur ran through the assembled commanders. These were not harsh terms by the standards of the 15th century. Many cities that had resisted siege and fallen by force had suffered far worse fates. "The Sultan also offers me personal terms," Constantine continued, his voice steady, but touched with something that might have been irony. "A principality in the Morea, a pension worthy of an emperor, safety for my family and household. All he asks in return is that I open the gates and formally surrender the city." Lucas Notaras leaned forward in his chair. "Your Majesty, these are generous terms. If you accepted them, no one could question your wisdom. You have done everything possible to save the empire. No emperor in our history has faced more impossible circumstances or shown greater courage in confronting them." Constantine smiled, and for a moment his face showed the warmth that had made him beloved by everyone who served him. "My dear Lucas, you speak as a friend and a loyal subject. But tell me, can you imagine Constantine the Great abandoning Rome? Can you picture Justinian fleeing from Constantinople? Can you see Basil II accepting a pension from a Bulgarian Tsar instead of defending the empire his ancestors built?" He rose from his chair and walked to one of the windows that overlooked the city. Below, Constantinople spread out in the morning light, its churches and markets and residential districts showing signs of normal life, continuing despite the crisis. Smoke rose from chimneys, people moved through the streets, children played in courtyards. It was a city that had endured for over 1,000 years, that had survived the rise and fall of kingdoms, the advance and retreat of civilizations, the birth and death of ideas that had shaped the world. "I am Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor," he said, his back still to the assembled council. "If the Roman Empire dies today, it will die with dignity. If the line of Caesar Augustus ends with me, it will end honorably. I would rather die as an emperor than live as a pensioner, no matter how generously I might be treated." He turned back to face the council, and every man in the room could see that his decision was final, irrevocable, born not from stubbornness or false pride, but from a profound understanding of what his position meant and what history would demand of him. George Francis, who had known Constantine longer than anyone else in the room, spoke with emotion of a lifetime friendship. "Your Majesty, we who love you will follow you wherever this path leads. But the historians of the future, they will write that you chose death over dishonor, that you valued the dignity of your office above your personal survival. They will remember you not as the emperor who lost Constantinople, but as the emperor who showed the world how a true sovereign faces impossible odds." "History will judge us all," Constantine replied, "but we cannot live for the judgment of historians we will never meet. We can only live according to the principles we believe to be true, the values we have sworn to uphold, the responsibilities we have accepted. Today, we have the opportunity to show that some things matter more than success, that honor, duty, loyalty, and love of one's people can triumph even in defeat." As the council meeting drew to its close, each man present understood that he had participated in something extraordinary. They had witnessed the final transformation of an emperor from a political leader into a symbol, from a ruler concerned with practical governance into a figure who embodied the eternal principles that had sustained civilization through its darkest hours. When they left the hall of the golden cupola, they carried with them not orders for military strategy, but inspiration for moral courage. They had seen a man choose meaning over survival, principles over pragmatism, the eternal values over temporal concerns. Whatever happened in the coming battle, they would face it knowing that they served not just an emperor, but an ideal that was larger than any individual life, more durable than any empire, more powerful than any army. The last council of Byzantium was ended. The final test was about to begin. As our journey through the last night of Constantinople draws to its close, the eastern sky brightens with the approach of dawn over the Bosphorus, the city that has sheltered our story, with its marble palaces and soaring churches, its ancient walls and narrow streets, prepares to face a transformation that will echo through history. But in the gentle crackling of the fire beside you, in the quiet rhythm of your breathing, in the peaceful darkness behind your closed eyelids, something of that night lives on. The courage of Constantine reading philosophy while empires crumbled around him. The wisdom of Anna preserving memories that might otherwise be lost forever. The faith of Helena comforting children with stories that connected them to something eternal. The dedication of scholars saving books, of bakers making bread, of ordinary people choosing to meet extraordinary circumstances with grace and dignity. These were not the actions of people who had given up hope. They were the actions of people who understood that hope itself sometimes means accepting that what you love most deeply may not survive in its present form, but that its essence, its beauty, its wisdom, its capacity to inspire, can live on in ways you cannot imagine. Tomorrow, cannons will thunder and the walls will shake. History will pivot on its great wheel, and the world will be forever changed. But tonight, in space between sleeping and waking, between one age and another, between what was and what will be, we have walked with people who showed us what it means to be fully human in the face of the impossible. Let the fire beside you burn lower now. Let your breathing grow deeper and more peaceful. Let the marble corridors of Byzantium fade gently into dreams, carrying with them the voices of people who lived 1,000 years ago, but who understood truths that are eternal. The empire ended, but the story continues. In every act of courage, in every moment of grace under pressure, in every choice to preserve beauty and wisdom and love even when the future is uncertain, something of that last night in Constantinople lives on. Sleep now, and dream of cities that never fall because they are built not of stone, but of the human heart at its finest hour.